Apparently, the Trudeau Liberals knew about the problems with the Chinese vaccine partnership just days after the Prime Minister announced the deal, according to documents tabled in the House of Commons. To talk about this and other big issues from the Hill is political reporter Brian Lilley from the Toronto Sun. Brian, why did the Liberals keep this hidden from us for so many months?
Well, they kept it hidden for about 2 months, and they kept the hopes for the deal ahead until late August. And yet, days after the Prime Minister first spoke about this deal on May 16th, the government found out there were problems. So let me give you a timeline on this. On May 6th, the National Research Council signed a deal with CanSino Biologics to develop a COVID-19 vaccine. CanSino Biologics at that point was considered one of the leading contenders for a COVID-19 vaccine. They'd already been approved for human trials in China. They were going to find other countries to partner with, other research labs to partner with for these human trials. So they signed the deal on May 6th. On May 12th, the deal is announced. As often happens, it's days later once you get all the I's dotted and T's crossed. May 12th, they announced the deal. May 16th, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, at one of his Rideau Cottage updates, he was still doing them pretty much daily at that point, he came out and he talked about the deal and said this is good, and if this works out, we'll be able to make the vaccine here in Canada, which we really wish we could at this point. But May 19th, the government of Canada found out that the Chinese government was blocking shipments of what they call the vaccine seeds, the ingredients to make sure that the vaccine would work here, that they could develop it here, that they could do the clinical trials here. 3 days after the Prime Minister, but the public didn't find out until July. The government kept hoping until late August that this was going to be a possibility, and the Prime Minister defended it. This is a big part of the reason that Canada is behind other countries in getting its population vaccinated, and it's one of the reasons that the Trudeau government is facing so much pressure, so many questions, especially now that we've got problems with other vaccines and doses not showing up.
What's interesting, there's a Calgary-based company now that's come out with, I think it's Providence Therapeutics is coming out with human trials with their vaccine, but it won't be ready until the end of the year, so before we can try it on people again. Now, Brian, while Canada was dealing with zero vaccines being delivered this week and a cut of 80% or more for next week, countries in Europe are not facing the same kind of cut. Brian, there's talk that the EU is considering banning exports of key vaccines for Canada.
So many problems around what's going on with Pfizer and potentially Moderna. Moderna so far has been a partner that has delivered when they said. They've been delivering every 3 weeks. Pfizer was supposed to be doing weekly deliveries and was faring well. Sometimes there'd be a few doses short, a few thousand doses short. But when you're talking about 200,000 doses being delivered, okay, so you're off by 4,000. Not a big deal. We will manage. Maybe next time we'll get a few thousand doses more. This week we're getting 0 doses. Now, if you remember, on January 15th, the minister in charge of procuring vaccines, Anita Anand, actually announced that, well, this is something that's going to affect all countries. This is something that everyone obtaining their vaccine from the Belgian plant is going to deal with. And it'll be about a 50% cut for 4 weeks while the plant retools and is able to produce more vaccines faster. That's not what has happened. European countries, according to the Associated Press, EU countries will get 92% of their vaccine doses across the 27-member trading bloc. Some countries have seen doses cut by as much as 50%. Poland and Romania, for example. Italy saw a cut of 20%, and they're threatening to sue. But Canada, 100% cut. 86% next week, according to some estimates, but it's at least 80%. And we don't know what we're getting the week of February 8th and February 15th. The Prime Minister couldn't answer that question when asked earlier this week. So, you put that against the backdrop of the EU now saying we may ban the export of COVID vaccines until we are looked after. And Canada is in a bad spot because Pfizer, Moderna, and AstraZeneca, which will soon be approved by Health Canada, are all manufactured in Europe. That's where we would get our doses from, and it's going to leave us in a bad spot.
Brian, this week marks 1 year since the first case of COVID-19 arrived in Canada. Now, a year ago, you were documenting how the first case slipped through our ineffective screening system, and a year later, you say data shows cases are still slipping through.
Well, we've got these new variants that are coming in, the British variant, the South African variant, the Brazilian variant showing up in Canada. They're coming in via travel. You know, these don't spontaneously appear inside our population. So, you know, we know that they're coming in through travel through various ways. But it was a year ago, you're right, that the first case showed up. It was a man from Richmond Hill, Ontario, arrived in Canada after going home to visit family for the Lunar New Year in Wuhan, China. He came back after a couple of weeks in China, you know, saw the signs, saw the documentation saying you've got to alert us if you've been to Wuhan. He said, yes, I've been to Wuhan. Are you feeling any symptoms? Well, I've got a cough. And they said, okay, on you go. And they let him go home. That man should have been quarantined on the spot, as should have his wife been. My understanding is that they both did recover, thankfully. They did survive. But that shows you how weak it was at the beginning. Now we've got the data from the Calgary airport showing 1.5% of the people arriving in Calgary that they test after they touch down are testing positive for COVID-19. That is, may seem like a small number. Epidemiologists say, no, that's disturbingly high. In Toronto, at the airport here, it's about 2.4% of the people that they're testing through their voluntary program that are testing positive for COVID-19. And that program launched after the federal government said you need a COVID negative test just to board a plane to come to Canada. So obviously people are slipping through. We've had more than 100 flights with COVID positive people arrive since this requirement of a negative test on January 7th. People are slipping through. We need to start taking this more seriously.
Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has been talking about tougher measures at the border and with flights. What will some of those tougher measures potentially look like?
Well, what Premier Ford would like is mandatory testing because Pearson Airport in Toronto is the busiest one in the country, especially for international flights, and they can't even get the feds to agree with what there is happening in Calgary. There's only four airports that are taking regularly scheduled international flights: Vancouver, Calgary, Toronto, Montreal, and we're not testing people that are arriving. So that's a big request. But some premiers have told the prime minister they want him to go further. There is data out there showing that people are not following the quarantine order. So we brought in the quarantine order 2 months after the first case touchdown on March 25th, 2020. Some anonymized cell data shows that about 23% of the time, people that are supposed to be home and quarantining, yeah, they're out and about in the community, which means some of them are going to be COVID positive, some of them are going to spread it in the community, and then people don't know where they got it. They say, well, I wasn't traveling, I don't know where it came from, and so on and so on and so on. It's like the old shampoo ad, they told two friends and they told two friends, and it just gets worse. So they'd like to see the prime minister either shut down leisure travel, so all those flights from Cancun to Calgary would be shut down. They'd like to see him say, you know what, if you're going to travel, you have to stay in a hotel on your own dime for 2 weeks when you come back. No more going home and skirting the rules. You're going to pay for it. It's part of your flight. Just consider the cost before you leave.
But
other countries are doing that. We could see that soon.
But you know what? If we're going to talk about canceling travel, maybe we should start with the politicians, the federal and provincial politicians. Have them
I
stay
would
home
agree.
first. Lead by example, right? Now, the Biden administration's first order of business was to kill the Keystone XL pipeline expansion, Brian. Now, the Biden camp is talking protectionist measures with its Buy America campaign. So is the Trudeau government going to fight for Canadian businesses or just kind of roll over the way they did for Keystone?
You know, one of the saddest things that I saw was the Trudeau government immediately turn and say, well, it's time to move on. That was Environment Minister John Wilkinson. That was our ambassador in Washington, who, by the way, will only say things that the government actually tells her to say. That's her job. I'm not picking on her, but that's her job. The Trudeau government does not want to fight for Keystone. Sadly, a poll from Angus Reid Institute shows that outside of Saskatchewan and Alberta, most Canadians say, time to move on. But yet when it comes to standing up for other industries, the Prime Minister was asked about that this week, and he was stood there and proudly talked about all the times he stood up to Donald Trump on aluminum and steel and supply management for dairy farmers and all these other issues. And In one case, Hal, they brought in countervailing tariffs on American products the same day the Americans announced a new tariff on aluminum and steel. The same day. But yet, when it comes to oil and gas, they're not willing to fight. So he says he'll stand up to Joe Biden on Buy American. I'm not sure that he will, but let me tell you, the pressure from vote-rich regions of Ontario and Quebec will be very difficult for him to resist because there's an awful lot of manufacturing that goes on here, and they sell parts into the United States. Well, if it's a government contract, those parts, those companies are going to be banned. That's going to be a huge economic hit. And he's already rolled over on Keystone, so why won't he roll over on this? That will be the view of the Biden administration, which, let me remind you, Joe Biden was part of the Obama administration, which had some of the toughest Buy American restrictions during the 2008-2009 economic recovery plan.
Brian, a big story we had last week was the resignation of Julie Payet as Governor General, a story I believe you broke first. Now, there have been stories about a toxic work environment for many months at the Governor General's office. What finally made her leave? Was the promise of the over $140,000 pension for life?
Well, I think it was more the report that was going to come out, and the report was apparently damning. Now, I've also been told that the report was a report, but not an investigation. That they listened to people who say, "Oh, she's an awful boss," but they didn't investigate to say, "Okay, well, how was she an awful boss? Was there any merit to the claims?" Look, the civil service in Ottawa can be sleepy at the best of times, but Rideau Hall is among the sleepiest. So I think that there is probably a lot of truth to what was said about Julie Payet and how she was as a manager. But I also think that there were issues around the civil service not being used to having a demanding manager and people that expect things to be completed by deadline. So a bit of column A and column B. But by the time the report came out, Julie Payet was just exhausted and ready to say, enough is enough. The pension, by the way, is going to be a lot less than she was earning before she was Governor General and a lot less than what she was earning as Governor General.
As for finding a replacement for Ms. Payet, will the Prime Minister go back to using a nonpartisan committee?
He would not commit to that. I mean, this is part of the problem with appointing Julie Payet is she was the hand-picked candidate of Justin Trudeau in his Prime Minister's office. They did not do vetting. It took the media a matter of hours to start finding embarrassing stories and embarrassing questions for the government on Ms. Payet and her appointment. Hours, not days, hours. The government did not vet. Prior to the appointment of Julie Payet, there was a nonpartisan committee that was set up by the Harper Conservatives. And their job was to look at potential candidates and give the government a short list. The Trudeau Liberals got rid of that. And when asked, will you go back to it? Which everyone thinks it's a good idea. Prime Minister Trudeau would not commit.
Now, we chatted last week about the federal Conservatives kicking social conservative Derek Sloan out of their caucus. This week, it's the Liberals who are parting ways with one of their own. Who would that be?
It's a Brampton Liberal MP named Ramesh Sangha. And he was kicked out not for being an extremist, but for saying that the Liberal Party has extremists inside of it. We're talking about Khalistani extremists. Now, if you don't know the Khalistani issue, these are people that believe that the Indian region of Punjab should separate from India and become a Sikh national homeland. So there is a religious element to this, but a heavy politicized one. And not all Sikhs want to do this. In fact, the current chief minister of Punjab is an observant Sikh named Captain Singh, and he took the Trudeau government to task. If you remember Trudeau's horrible trip to India, where it was just embarrassment after embarrassment, at first, the man in charge of Punjab, essentially the premier, I guess would be the closest equivalent, would not meet with the prime minister until he saw statements from Trudeau and ministers saying, we don't support an independence movement for Punjab. Well, this Liberal MP, Ramesh Sangha, says there are still radicals inside. This was an interview that he did on Punjabi language media in Brampton after the resignation of Navdeep Bains. He claims that Bains is one of these people. He also claims others are, like Harjit Sajjan, the defense minister. Now, I couldn't find statements from Baines distancing himself from this. I'm not saying that he is a Khalistani extremist, but I'm saying I couldn't find the statements. But there have been statements from Harjit Sajjan. So, obviously a lot of hurt within the Liberal Party over this. But when conservatives are accused of flirting with any type of extremism, there are questions after questions. The Liberals are trying to sweep this under the rug. I say more questions have to be asked.
Political reporter and Toronto Sun columnist Brian Lilley, thanks again for your time today.
Thank you, Hal.